So, how effective or good is your skin, my skin, in blocking toxic chemicals found in everyday products like moisturizers, mascaras, sunscreen from seeping into our bodies? Well, today we'll be diving deep into this topic with none other than Dr. Oddny, a scientist who spent years in the laboratory unlocking the truth about what's really getting into our bodies. Her recent groundbreaking study has made waves around the world, from TV screens to headline news. So stick around, because in the next 30 to 40 minutes, Oddny is going to be helping us understand what her key findings were and how she went about making these discoveries. Trust me, you don't want to miss this. So let's jump in. But a good way to start is for you to tell us a bit about Iceland. The country, the people, the food, the place. What can you tell us about Iceland as a country?
I can tell you a lot of things. Iceland is an island in the north of the world. It's a beautiful place. It's often called the land of fire and ice. We have glaciers, we have
Oh,
volcanoes, we have geysers, hot springs. We have a lot of natural beauty. We have great food, since you mentioned food. We have great chefs here, a lot of seafood, lamb.
when you say
Yes.
great food, which one stands out for you
We
as
have
an
great
individual?
seafood here. We have really fresh fish because we're an island, so it's always very fresh. But we also, just for some reason, we're very small. We're only around 400,000 people, but we have so many great chefs. It's pretty amazing.
So, if you compare it to your experience here in the UK when you were
Yeah.
here, what do you think food wise?
So we cannot compete with the UK with Indian and Asian food. UK is always going to win. But I would say definitely if you go to an average restaurant, or even if like slightly pricier restaurant, in the UK you can get food that is not that great. In Iceland,
Yeah.
you would always get good. It's always going to be quite good, if not amazing. So
Okay. I've never
no,
been, but you seem to be encouraging me to come around one
yeah.
of these days.
We also have a lot of swimming pools. There's one just outside my office
Oh,
window.
okay.
So that's something we're known for, and a lot of natural hot springs as well, where you can bathe in nature.
So when you say you're known for swimming, do you guys have a lot of people who compete internationally, like Olympics and all of that?
No, we don't. No. So when I say we have a lot of swimming pools, when we go to the swimming pool, we mostly go for the hot tubs. If I'm honest,
Oh, I see.
we have outdoor swimming pools that are open all year round, but there's usually one swimming pool, and then there are like 3 or 4 different temperature hot tubs, and that's where the people are.
I see. Considering the size of the country, how would you judge or place them in terms of, should I say them or you, in terms of environmental interests and efforts?
We are quite lucky in Iceland because we have a lot of natural resources. So almost all of our energy, for example, is green. We have hydropower, or
Oh,
yeah,
100% green.
almost. So we have a lot of hydropower, and then we have also geothermal energy. For example, all our houses are heated up with hot water from the earth. We don't heat it up ourselves. We can use the hot water that's just naturally occurring. And that's also what we get from the tap, the hot water from the tap. So people say Iceland smells like sulfur, but I don't smell it. That's the only bad.
You wouldn't.
That's
It's
the
your
bad side
country.
effect of using the natural one. So
I see.
we are quite green in that way, and because we have a lot of mountains, we have a lot of national parks and green areas where we do a lot of outdoor sports, so hiking, skiing, like mountain biking is very popular. So people spend a lot of time in nature. We also have because we have all this nature that people love to look at, we also realize how dangerous nature can be, because the elements can be unpredictable. So I would say having that time we spent outside and seeing the different areas and different elements, we kind of start to respect nature a little bit more, I would say.
You're touching on something interesting there. This link between nature, health, and
Yeah.
longevity, right? Do you see that practically in the average life expectancy of people in Iceland, and maybe health conditions of people? Does that reflect clearly that relationship with
That's
nature?
a good question. I haven't looked at it specifically, but we have quite high average age, like a longevity of the Icelandic people. But I don't know how much that is to do with the diet, and how much it is to do with this nature element.
We just interaction with nature, right? Okay. All right. It looks like we can talk about Iceland for the whole of the day, but that's not the only thing my audience will be interested in hearing. So, a bit about you now. What exactly attracted you to this field?
So that's maybe a bit of a long story. So I started my bachelor's here in Iceland in chemistry, where I did actually synthesis, so inorganic and organic synthesis. But I got a summer job after my first year working in a lab. It was actually a food analysis lab, but there was a lady there who was an environmental chemist. And she kind of told me about the field. And then there was one course at the university as well, which I took, was about environmental toxicology, which also piqued my interest. And from there, I learned about a master's program in Sweden, in Örebro in Sweden, called Master of Chemistry in Environmental Forensics. And that's what I decided to do and went on to do. And that's how when I really became like introduced to this subject, to the different aspects, different chemicals, like pollutants. And yeah, that's from there was no turning back.
So for you, it's like the field called you, kind of, not you picking the field.
No, it was a mix of both, because I realized during my bachelor's I wasn't loving the synthesis aspect. But when I did the summer project, I was doing analysis, chemical analysis, and I really enjoyed that. I thought that was so interesting. So I wanted to do analysis, and then I wanted to do something related to nature. Yeah, I was thinking geochemistry, but then I heard about this environmental chemistry, and yeah.
Environmental chemistry. And how are you finding it so far? Interesting, or like I'm in the wrong place?
No, I really enjoy it. I think it's very interesting. In some aspects, it's overwhelming, because, of course, it's a huge field, and there's so many different chemicals out there. Not all bad, of course, but but I enjoy the work. I like to think that we're trying to make the world better.
Considering the nature of your work and, these findings, some of which are quite grim, do you get to a point sometimes where you feel, this is too much, I can't take this anymore? I ask this question because there's this issue about eco-anxiety where young people are getting very scared about what's happening. And so when I think about people like you who are in the core of it, who see the results, who test these things and see, and I wonder sometimes how the effect would be on you as an individual.
Yeah, sometimes I feel like the more I know, the more stressed I am. But usually that's just a quick moment that passes. Because I also know that there are people out there who are trying to find the solution to their problems. And we are trying to figure out how we can improve the world for the future generation. So, yeah, feel this stress as well sometimes, but just need to take a step back and realize that we are trying to. There are people trying to make the world a better place. So focus on that.
Okay, that's interesting. So, coming to your actual work now, we're definitely going to talk about your paper on PFAS, but are there other similar research you've done in the past that you think are of interest?
So most of my research has been related to PFAS in some way. What I've been doing before my current job here. So during my master's, I was also looking at PFAS. I was looking at PFAS and bile acids, which are chemicals which our body produces it, and is used in the digestion. And they're actually a bit similar to PFAS. So I was looking at how PFAS can affect the bile acid synthesis, or actually how, if that affects the bile acid synthesis, and how that would affect people with anorexia.
So what do you think drives this interest in PFAS?
I think it's an interesting question. I think researchers have been getting more and more interested in this field because we're realizing how extremely persistent these chemicals are. We've been realizing more and more how spread around it is, how big the distribution of these chemicals are. So actually research started around 2000. Like that's when it got more and more. That's when we realized that it can be found all the way in the North Pole. That's when we first detected it in human blood. So I would say that kind of started the ball rolling, and then from there it grew. Just the realization how big this chemical group is, and how persistent they are.
And is that part of what attracted you as an individual to researching PFAS, or are there other reasons why you picked PFAS as your interest, your pollutant of interest?
My pollutant of interest. That was kind of by chance. That PFAS were my pollutant of interest. So during my master's project, I was looking at PFAS, like I said, and that was just because I thought the project sounded interesting. So that's why I chose PFAS there. And then once I read more and more about them, I felt like I wanted to.
Became more fascinating.
I need to know more.
What's this forever devil?
How can we fix this problem?
Okay.
But,
okay. So this particular research, you're looking at let me allow you to just give us a brief background. So this particular research, what is it about? Why did you decide to investigate that specific question? And what were you looking or hoping to get from this research?
So what we did we were looking at the thermal absorption of PFAS. So if PFAS can penetrate through our skin and enter our bodies. So we wanted to understand if this was a route for us to be exposed to PFAS through. And this is something that hadn't been studied before, or very few studies have been performed, and only on one chemical out of it's a huge class of chemicals, but in the end I had 17 in my study. And it was something new. It hadn't been done before, and we know that there are certain items that we use on our skin that do contain PFAS, so we felt like this was an important question that needed to be answered. If we're using these products with PFAS on our skin, how will it affect us? So
when you say we use a lot of things we use on our skin, I believe you're talking about things like sunscreen, mascara. Is that how
mascara?
To mascara? Foundation. Can you give us a brief list of the kind of things?
So there is
that people use every day that can expose their skin.
Yeah. So there are a few different types of cosmetics and creams that contain PFAS. it just depends on the product, really. It's not all sunscreen contain PFAS, but certain sunscreens, certain face creams, certain foundations or mascaras. Then there are also PFAS in waterproof clothing. So that's also something. And even in the US, they found it in school uniforms, because school uniforms have been treated to be stain repellent, because kids don't want to be, people don't want their kids to look dirty. So they put stain repellent on the school uniforms. But then that stain repellent is laced with PFAS, because that's what gives it.
Sorry, let me question that a bit. So from what you're saying, it sounds more like, so those properties that make them use PFAS in things like, so for example, you talk about stain proofing and then water repellent, obviously. And most likely that's why they would use it for like water repellent foundations and all these other stuffs. Those properties, I'm aware, also are some of the reasons why PFAS, most of them are a bit difficult to deal with. Is that correct?
Yes. Or it's the same reason that, or it's the same thing that makes them persistent, makes them also useful for some things.
Let's look at the research itself a bit more. So how did you go about the actual investigation? Because I saw a paper some time ago where they used, I think someone volunteered or people volunteered and they used human volunteers.
Yes,
are you aware of that paper?
I am aware of that paper.
What's your thought about, because when I saw that, there was a bit, it's like, that's dangerous, but I don't know, because for ethical reasons, even using rats and what do you call them, guinea pigs and all of that, it's becoming, people are struggling to face that out. So I don't know how you would use a human being. What's your thought about that?
I am not keen on living human volunteers being used as test subjects for obvious reasons. It can be dangerous.
Yeah, because you don't know the outcome, right? What if it turns out that the person is going to die at the end of the research?
I mean,
how did you go, seeing that it's wrong to use human samples, and I mean, it could be ethically questionable to use other lower animals. How did you go about testing the effect on the skin then?
So we didn't want to use any live animals for our research. So what we used was cultured skin cells. So it's called 3D human skin equivalent models. So it is just a cell line that has been grown in the lab. It is human skin cells. So it has similar properties to real human skin. And actually, a team at Birmingham has previously done studies on these models where they compare them to ex vivo human skin. So real human skin that has been donated to science after cosmetic procedures. So it's from living people, and they found that it's very similar, has very similar barrier function as the ex vivo skin. So these models are
okay. So I think there's need for us to actually examine this properly, because this is an area that some people might question what you've done, and so it's good for us to dig into it properly. So what you're saying is, they've taken your 3D model of a skin and they've compared it to actual skin sample, and the difference is pretty much not there.
So they did these exposure experiments. So they exposed it. They had brominated flame retardants, so a different pollutant, and exposed both the skin model and actual human skin. And they found that it was very similar. They had very similar barrier functions. But so they proved to have very similar properties as the real human skin. So we felt that it would be a good model for us to use for our studies.
Okay, so how did you go about using this particular 3D skin then?
So what we did is these cells come in a special insert. So that's a complicated thing to explain. So the model sits in a little insert, and then underneath the model we have a culture medium for the cells. And this has a similar. It's very similar to our blood in salt content and things like that. So it's what's mimicking the blood in our bodies, and that's below the skin cells. And on top of the skin cells, there's nothing. It's just air. So on the top of the skin cells is just like the surface of our skin. Yeah. So we have the skin surface, we have the skin cell, and then underneath there's the receptor fluid, which is like the bloodstream. So we put PFAS on top of the skin, on the skin surface, and then we let it sit for 36 hours in total. And then at 15 different time points over that 36 hours, we sampled the receptor fluid. So we sampled the blood and then replaced it. So we always had the same volume underneath. And at the end of the exposure period, at 36 hours, I collected the last of the receptor fluid and I washed the skin surface with some cotton. I washed it well, and then I kept those samples, the cotton samples, and then I kept the skin cells as well. So in the end, I had samples of the receptor fluid, I had samples of the skin itself, so I could know if there were PFAS left inside the skin, and then I had samples of what was left on top of the skin. So we could see exactly where the PFAS were after those 36 hours.
My first question, I have a lot of questions on what you've just said, but my first question would be, so you apply PFAS directly, right?
Yes.
But in reality, we don't come in contact with that PFAS directly. So did you dilute it to the concentration that exists in these things that people use, or how do you make sure that it's the same way that we are exposed to it naturally that you exposed that skin to?
So actually, we had a much higher concentration than what is found naturally or in the products we use. But there was a reason for that. Because this was the first study, we wanted to see how the process happens. We wanted to see how long it takes the PFAS to penetrate the skin, and we wanted to see how the kinetics of the process. So to do that, we used higher concentration to be able to see earlier the PFAS penetrating. But by plotting the kinetics, we can also calculate a permeation coefficient for the PFAS.
Sorry, you will lose my audience. What do you mean by permeation coefficient?
Yes,
please?
I will explain. So thermal permeation is closely related to the dose that you apply. So the more you apply, in most cases, the more you apply, the smaller the percentage you see that is permeated. But it can be, for some, it depends on the chemical. Sometimes the higher the dose, the more permeation. But for some cases, the higher the dose, the less permeation. So that's when you talk about how many percentages are entering through. But we estimated the permeation coefficient. So that's a coefficient. It's a number that doesn't change. And this is independent of the dose. So we wanted to establish this coefficient, which we can then use to calculate exposure based on other scenarios. For example, if you are exposed to a cream that contains X amount of PFAS for 6 hours, we can use the permeation coefficient for that PFAS and calculate what would that mean for you? How much would you be exposed to?
Yeah. All right. So that's interesting. So what did you find? Did the PFAS... I'm hoping the PFAS did not get through the skin. None of it got through the skin. Because these skins are so tough. Nothing gets through them.
it is supposed to be... It is a protective barrier, so it's not something you hope happens.
the way you're being nice about what you're about to say. I know
Yeah.
you didn't see what we were hoping you would see.
No, so I did see that, like I said, I included 17 pfas, so it's only a fraction of what we see out in the world. But
Okay.
I did see that they are able to permeate the skin, especially the shorter chain compounds. The longer chain ones were way less permeable, especially the longest chain ones didn't permeate at all through the skin, but I did find some of them inside the skin cells. So
Just to touch on that a bit. So when you say longer chain and shorter chain ones, I'm aware that the longer chain ones have been found to be more toxic, although we don't know much about some of the shorter chain ones, because people have thought that the shorter chain ones could be a replacement for the longer chain ones. So the question then becomes, which ones do you think, and it's okay if you haven't looked at these, which ones do you think would have more in these everyday products that we use? Do you think it's going to be more of the longer chain ones or more of the shorter chain ones? Or is just like a mix of all? Or do you think we are currently moving away from the longer, more towards the shorter? What's your view on that?
So that's a good point, that the shorter chains have been thought of as a replacement for the longer chain ones, because they seem to have less effects on our health. But if we are replacing all the long chain ones with the short chain ones, we will be exposed to the short chain ones in higher concentrations. So even in these products, there's a mixture of this. It's more common to see the shorter chain compounds, but what's also more common are so-called precursors compounds. So these are chemicals that are slightly different to the ones that I was focusing on, which were perfluorocarboxylic acids and perfluorosulfonates. But these precursors compounds can break down into these carboxylic acids and sulfonates. So in the end, they can end up as these chemicals. But it is slightly more common to see the shorter chain ones.
So the long and short of it is, if we use creams and all these things we use that contain PFAS, there's high likelihood that this PFAS can pass through our skin into our bloodstream.
Yeah, but like I said, I didn't investigate the precursor compounds themselves. So how those will react with the skin, if they will permeate as themselves, or if they will be transformed in some way by the skin and then permeate.
But with the PFAS, you have some certainty with PFAS. It's the precursor compounds that you're talking about now. But with PFAS, you have certainty. The PFAS you looked at, the ones you looked at, some of them actually got through the skin into the blood.
Yes.
That's what we can conclude.
The ones we studied. But
you studied. Okay. So you said you looked at 17 PFAS. How many of them went through and how many did not? And I think I read in your paper you categorized into 3 groups. Those 3 categories again?
So we could see that we could split the permeation into three, like you say. So we could say how much had passed through, how much was left inside the skin. So it had breached the surface, but hadn't passed into the bloodstream. So it was still inside the skin. And then we could see how much was left on top of the skin for each of the PFAS we studied. And we had 17 PFAS, and the carboxylic acids, we had 4 that had significant permeation, so over 10%. And then we had, of the sulfonates, we had also 4 that had more than 5% permeation. And then there are a few that had like 0.1 up to 1% permeation, so it's lower, but then we could find more of them inside the skin. So we could see up to 68, almost 70% of some of the compounds
Okay, so
inside.
at this second, you're talking of the second category now, where they pass through the skin. They haven't quite gotten into the blood yet, but they are somewhere in the skin and might eventually end up in the blood.
But that's a limitation we have with our study, because we cannot say if these chemicals pass eventually completely through into the bloodstream, or because the skin has a property where it can clean itself out again, like you sweat and then you excrete chemicals as well. So I can't say for certain that all of the people
they will go in.
But still, that they were able to enter the skin cells themselves was quite interesting, because these are larger molecules. So we thought it was less likely, because the skin, like we were saying before, it's a protective organ. So it doesn't usually let bigger molecules through. So that surprised me.
Is there any possible correlation between those that may have penetrated the skin and maybe not quite gotten through to the blood? Is there any possibility that they can have things like skin cancer effect and things like that? Or that's a bit too much?
I actually don't know the correlation between skin cancer and PFAS. But there have been some studies in mice where they expose them to some of the PFAS in quite high doses, and then they see changes in the skin. So these chemicals definitely can have an impact, but that was very high doses. So usually in day-to-day life, you wouldn't be exposed to such high.
But again, because they are persistent, even if you are exposed to low doses over a long period of time, if the time it takes your body to get rid of it is not as fast as the time it takes to come in,
the thing.
The dose would eventually accumulate. So
that's a good point.
It's a tricky one. Okay. Any other interesting thing that you saw that you were not expecting, but that was like, wow, that's shocking? Is there any other such findings?
Just I was surprised.
I know the fact that you saw it penetrating is big enough.
And I mean,
who knows if
the values we saw were higher than I expected. So I didn't expect to see such a large fraction permeate through. Actually,
60%.
Yeah, it was.
You said 60
almost. It was 58. The highest, or 58.9, so 59% almost. So it was. Okay. That was surprising.
So, looking at all of that now, and I know you've mentioned things about limitations of your research. So where do you think the research should be going from here, considering what you have done so far now?
So what would be very interesting is to expose these 3D human skin equivalent models to real samples, for example, fabric samples or cosmetics and creams. So that's something that hopefully can be done very soon. But that's something I would be very interested in seeing.
And are you expecting for there to be much difference between? So obviously, PFAS in, say, cream is in a state that should be easier to pass through the skin than PFAS in the example you gave about school uniform, for example.
Yes.
Do you know of the existence of any studies where that difference has been examined?
No, I don't know particularly, but when you have to think about, so the first step in thermal permeation, so if you are exposed to something via your skin, it has to be in a solution to be able to penetrate. So the first step, and like what I was talking about before, we have the sweat. We have sweat, and then we have sebum, which is the oily substance. So we have a water-based and an oil-based liquid that our skin naturally excretes, and chemicals can be dissolved in these liquids. So that's how we can be exposed for something that's in fabrics, because we are wearing the fabrics, we're sweating, and chemicals are released into our sweat, and then they are in solution on top of our skin, and that's how the permeation can happen. So even though creams, you would not have to have the same process necessarily happen, I have to admit I'm not sure how that works for creams. So it would most likely happen faster, yes, but I'm not sure there have been studies on exactly the difference between fabrics and creams and that.
Okay, talking about happening faster, and I'm taking this somewhere. What are the factors that affected the rates at which the PFAS passed through? Did temperature have any effect?
I did not look at different temperatures. I had my skin cells were kept at just below 37 degrees, so it's similar to what the skin surface is.
Okay.
So we didn't want to change that too much.
You know where I'm going with that question? Could it be that hotter countries, there will be higher risk than colder countries, so that they'll start moving towards Antarctica or something?
That's a good question. Definitely, if you're sweating more, because then you have more solution on top of your skin, you're more chemicals being released into your sweat. So definitely that would be a factor. But in the permeation itself, I can't answer that.
So, but were there other factors that you observed that might be responsible? Like, I'm sure exposure time was a factor.
Yes.
Are there other factors that you thought would have effect?
So it is the exposure time. It is the dose. The dose is going to be of course a major factor. And then, the level of sweat.
If we look at exposure time critically, how fast after you expose the skin? You said you measure every 15 minutes, did you say?
No, it was 36 hours.
No, you expose for 36 hours, right? Yeah. But you measure every...
it was 15 different time points over the 36 hours. So I took at 30 minutes was my first time point. And then 1 hour.
Okay. And at that 30 minutes, you had found some of it had gone through already? Is there any instance where some had gone through already at 30 minutes of exposure?
Yes. For 3 of the PFAS, I did already start to see something. But for most of them, it took, like for 4 of them, it took less than an hour. But for 4 of them, it took multiple hours. And what we're seeing with the longer chain ones, with them being found within the skin but not penetrating through, that could also indicate that it's just a very slow process.
Yeah.
And that's also what they saw with the human subject study. They saw they saw the highest serum levels of PFOA 22 days after the exposure. So it was a very slow process.
Okay. So considering the interesting findings of your studies now, how do you think policymakers, decision makers, governments, and all of that, what do you think they can take from your study, and how can you influence? If, for instance, I bring what's the next COP? COP 30? What's the next COP? And we bring you in front of them and say, tell them what to do. What aspect of your work do you think can influence serious change?
That's a huge question. Hopefully, we realize that the need for these chemicals in products, like we've been discussing, is not necessarily there. What is the contribution of the chemicals? But for example, there are so many companies and products that make these products but don't have PFAS in them. So it obviously is possible.
Yeah.
So maybe we need to just take a step back and look at the necessity of these chemicals.
Yeah. And something else I think your work would do is, you see, when people talk about these pollutants and these chemicals, oftentimes it is like a distant occurrence. People don't really relate with these things. But what your work has done is it has brought it home. So now I'm talking to you about the cream that you
Yeah.
use. I'm talking to you about the thing you use on your body. So
Yes.
I think that makes it more personal. People will be able to relate more with it and say, we need to do something about this thing. And like you said, well, I wouldn't say it's easy to just say stop using it because, there has to be an alternative.
Yes.
There are alternatives.
Yes.
Those alternatives need to be, cost benefit analysis. If I'm buying a mascara for 20 pounds and it costs me 60 pounds to make it, who else would buy it? So
Yeah.
these are factors that must come in, but there has to be a constant movement towards a point where we no longer use these things. I think
Definitely.
that's what is important and it's key. And there you have it, people. Scary results. Those annoying forever chemicals hiding in everything from personal care products to school uniforms are actually getting into our bodies through our skins. And that, I must say, is scary. But I'll say don't worry too much because you have got the power to make simple choices that can keep you and your loved ones safe. And we are always here to provide you with the facts you need to make those simple choices. So I'll say stay tuned, hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on any of our insightful videos. Stay green, stay informed, and remember, stay eco-led.